He never donated a cent to charity and didn't believe in second chances, until two dancing twin girls with his face and her eyes shattered everything he thought he knew. Garrett Winslow never donated to charity. He didn't write checks for causes, didn't sponsor galas, and never offered up his name for foundation plaques or hospital wings. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid events that involved anything resembling compassion. To him, charity was a sentimental distraction for people who didn't understand how the world really worked. He built skyscrapers, not sympathy. Everything he touched turned to profit. People respected him, or feared him, but no one would have dared to call him warm. And that was just how he liked it. He was a striking man, the kind people noticed the moment he entered a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits. His hair, a soft cascade of golden curls, framed a face that was all angles, strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes so piercingly blue they looked like polished glass. Everything about Garrett was sharp, polished, expensive. But there was no softness in him, not anymore. He had spent too many years in boardrooms and construction sites, too many late nights reviewing contracts and acquisitions, too much time building a world where nothing was left to chance. Kindness was for amateurs. Garrett built his empire with steel and concrete and certainty. So when he mistakenly showed up at the wrong venue that Thursday night, a charity event for children's art programs instead of the exclusive investor dinner he'd meant to attend, his first instinct was to turn around and leave. The ballroom was decorated with paper cranes and string lights, not crystal chandeliers and caviar. Children's paintings lined the hallway. A small string quartet played an overly cheerful tune near the entrance. It wasn't his scene. He took a step toward the exit, irritated with his assistant, already composing the scolding email in his mind. But then, just as he turned, the lights dimmed and a voice announced the next performance. From the Hope Studio Ballet program, please welcome Emma and Evie Moore. The audience clapped politely. Garrett barely registered the names. He wasn't listening. Until the music started. Two little girls stepped onto the stage in matching white ballet dresses. Their golden curls shimmered under the spotlight. Their faces, round, angelic, completely identical, were filled with a calm, concentrated grace far beyond their age. And their eyes. Blue. The exact same rare, ice-clear blue he saw every morning in the mirror. Garrett's body locked. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The girls danced with flawless synchronicity, spinning and leaping across the stage with surprising confidence. The room faded around him. There was no orchestra, no audience, no clinking of wine glasses. Just them. These two perfect, impossible mirrors of himself. And yet, he had never seen them before. He told himself it couldn't be real. That the resemblance was a trick of the light, that children often looked like adults, that it was coincidence. But he knew better. It was more than a resemblance. It was recognition. His jaw clenched, and his hands curled into fists at his sides, not from anger, but from something else, shock, maybe. Or fear. As the performance ended and the room erupted in applause, Garrett didn't clap. He simply stared. One of the girls gave a small bow, and as her arm moved gracefully toward her side, the light caught on something silver around her wrist. A bracelet. Delicate, thin, and shining. A shape and style that twisted something deep in his gut. He had seen that bracelet before. Years ago. And suddenly, everything he thought he knew about his life began to crack. The applause faded into a soft murmur, but Garrett remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on the two girls as they left the stage, still hand in hand. His mind refused to process what he had just witnessed. The resemblance was too precise, too perfect. It wasn't just their eyes or the way their curls bounced with each step, it was something deeper, something instinctual. A pull. A recognition. And that bracelet. That damn bracelet. A thin silver band, barely noticeable unless the light hit it just right. But he had seen it before. Years ago. On the wrist of a woman whose name he had almost managed to forget. He moved without thinking, weaving through the crowd, ignoring the polite conversations and curious glances as he followed the hallway toward the backstage area. A volunteer tried to stop him, but he brushed past with a cold look that didn't invite argument. He wasn't a man used to being told no. His shoes clicked against the polished floor as he rounded a corner and found a small corridor where children were gathering after their performances, laughing, hugging their instructors, their parents. And then he saw her. Not the girls, though they were there too, seated on a bench, sipping from juice boxes, but the woman beside them. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a dancer's posture and a tired kind of beauty. Auburn brown hair pulled into a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes that didn't hide the quiet fire in them. She crouched down to adjust one of the girl's ballet slippers and whispered something that made them both giggle. Garrett approached slowly. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to know. The woman stood up as he got closer and looked at him, puzzled. She didn't seem to recognize him, which somehow made it worse. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but steady. "Those girls, are they yours?" Her expression shifted immediately, defensive, protective. "Why do you ask?" Her tone was firm, but not rude. Garrett hesitated. "Because they look exactly like me." There was a pause. A deep, stretching silence. One of the girls, Emma, he thought, looked up and blinked at him with wide, curious eyes. The other kept sipping her juice, unaware of the storm gathering in the adult world. The woman straightened, arms crossed now. "I'm their aunt," she said. "Their mother was my sister." Garrett's heart pounded. "Was?" "She passed away," the woman said. 6 years ago. During childbirth. He felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. He had assumed, no, not assumed, hoped, that the mother would be someone he could confront, someone who could explain. But the thought that she was gone, that she had died bringing them into the world, tightened something sharp in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I didn't know." "What was her name?" The woman studied him, trying to read something in his expression. "Maggie. Maggie Moore." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Garrett had only known her for a short time, but he remembered the way she danced, the sound of her laugh, the softness in her voice when she said his name. They had spent one whirlwind weekend together, years ago, in a haze of music, wine, and something dangerously close to love. He never saw her again after that. He never looked. And now it was too late. "I knew her," he said quietly. "A long time ago. We were, together. Briefly." The woman's eyes narrowed. "And your name is?" "Garrett Winslow." She inhaled sharply. You're him." There was recognition now. Not from a photo or a memory, but from the stories her sister must have told. "She mentioned you. Once." Garrett nodded, overwhelmed. "And the bracelet?" he asked. "The one your niece was wearing." It looked like. "It was Maggie's," the woman said. "She wore it every day until she died. She gave it to Emma right before the girls turned 5. Told them it was from someone special." He swallowed hard. His past had never caught up with him like this. It had always been something he outran. But now it stood in front of him, sipping juice and smiling with the same crooked grin he had at that age. "Do they know?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated. "They know their mother loved someone very much. They don't know his name." Garrett looked down at the girls again. They weren't afraid of him. Not yet. They looked at him the way children look at anyone new, curiously, openly, without judgment. There was still time. "I want to know them," he said. "If you'll let me." The woman's eyes softened slightly, but the wariness didn't leave her face. "They've already lost enough. I won't let anyone else disappear on them." "I'm not going to disappear," he said, and this time, he wasn't just making a promise. He was making a vow. Garrett didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse, surrounded by silence and glass, the city lights outside casting reflections he didn't recognize anymore. The bracelet, the girls, Maggie's name echoing in that quiet hallway backstage, every moment replayed over and over in his mind, refusing to let him rest. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years, not since before he learned to bury anything that wasn't useful. But this wasn't something he could compartmentalize. He couldn't file it away under distraction or irrelevant. These girls weren't strangers. They were a part of him. By morning, he was already on the phone with one of the most discreet private investigators in New York, giving the man only two things: Maggie Moore's name and the year she died. He didn't tell him why, just that it was urgent. Within 48 hours, the file was in his hands. Garrett didn't know what he expected, but the report hit harder than anything he'd imagined. Maggie had died in a small local hospital after unexpected complications during childbirth. No father was listed on the birth certificates. Lauren Moore, her older sister, had stepped in as guardian immediately. No legal disputes. No questions. No extended family had come forward, and the girls had remained in Lauren's care ever since. They'd moved 3 times, always in modest neighborhoods, never far from dance schools or community centers. Lauren had taken on multiple jobs over the years, teaching, cleaning, whatever kept them fed and together. Garrett read the report twice, then set it down and stared out the window for a long time. Guilt was unfamiliar territory for him, but now it settled like an anchor in his gut. Maggie had died alone, giving life to 2 children who would never know her. And all the while, he'd been in boardrooms, winning awards, breaking records, convincing himself that his past didn't matter. He didn't want to just show up again without a plan, so he reached out to Lauren through a quiet channel, an assistant of hers from the studio who agreed to pass along a letter. It wasn't long or dramatic. He kept it simple: he wanted to help. Financially, emotionally, however she would allow. He wasn't asking to take the girls away or to disrupt their lives. He just wanted to be present. Lauren didn't respond immediately. But 4 days later, she called. Her voice was wary, but not cold. She told him the girls had asked about him, Emma, especially. She said the bracelet had become something sacred to them, a link to a story they didn't understand but deeply believed in. Lauren didn't promise him anything, but she agreed to let him visit. Not alone. Not yet. But he could come to the studio, observe quietly, and maybe, just maybe, begin to build something that looked like trust. The following afternoon, Garrett arrived early. The studio was small and worn around the edges, but it was filled with life. Kids giggled in the hallways, teachers offered gentle corrections, soft piano music drifted from one of the practice rooms. It was nothing like the steel and glass world he was used to. And it was beautiful. He stayed near the doorway, watching from a distance as the twins stretched at the bar. They moved in perfect sync, their expressions focused, their golden curls pinned back in matching buns. They hadn't seen him yet. He didn't want to startle them. Lauren approached him a few minutes later, arms crossed but a little less guarded. "They've had good days and bad," she said quietly. "They don't understand everything yet. But they're curious. Especially Emma. Evie's more cautious. She watches people before she lets them in." Garrett nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What were they like when they were babies? What was Maggie like in her final days? Did they talk about her? Did they talk about him? But he held it in. When class ended, the girls ran off to change, and Lauren offered him a moment to speak with them in the lobby. It was brief. Polite. Emma said hi first. Evie waved from behind her. He didn't try to touch them or push too hard. He just knelt to their level and said, "I'm glad I got to see you dance. You were both amazing." Emma smiled shyly. "Do you dance?" Garrett laughed softly. "Not even a little." She giggled. Evie stayed quiet, but she didn't look away. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't dramatic. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Garrett felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Garrett started visiting the studio regularly. At first, he kept his distance, standing quietly in corners, nodding to the instructors, never interfering. The girls began to notice him more. Emma would glance over her shoulder while stretching, flash a quick smile when she caught him watching, and then turn back to her routine like nothing had happened. Evie was slower to warm up. She rarely looked directly at him, but she never avoided him either. She observed him quietly, the way cautious children often do, with wide eyes and questions she didn't know how to ask yet. Lauren kept her promise, allowing him to be present but monitoring everything closely. She never left them alone with him, and Garrett didn't push for that. He knew he hadn't earned anything yet, not really. He was a stranger trying to undo a silence that had lasted nearly 7 years. And he understood something now that he hadn't before, being there wasn't about showing up once or twice with grand gestures. It was about consistency, humility, patience. Things no one had ever required from him until now. He started bringing small things. A new box of art supplies when he noticed the girls using worn-out crayons. Fresh leotards in soft pastel colors, careful to buy matching sets for both. He asked Lauren first every time. He didn't want to overstep. He didn't want to look like he was trying to buy their affection. But the girls didn't see it that way. They began to approach him after class, slowly at first. Emma asked questions, about his job, about buildings, about whether he'd ever been to Paris. Evie listened, and sometimes, she'd whisper a single-word comment to her sister and then smile when he responded. One rainy afternoon, Garrett offered to drive them home when Lauren's car wouldn't start. She hesitated, but the storm was getting worse, and the girls were already soaked from running to the studio entrance. In the car, Emma sat in the front seat, peppering him with questions about everything on the dashboard, while Evie stared out the window, quietly watching the rain streak across the glass. Garrett told them about his first building project, how he had once been terrified of public speaking, how he used to sneak out of piano lessons as a child. They laughed. It was small, silly stuff, but it was real. Later that week, he showed up at the studio with a surprise, a miniature-scale model of a building, designed with little ballet dancers carved into the facade. "I thought maybe someday you'd like to help design something like this," he told them. Emma beamed. Evie stepped closer to study the tiny details. Lauren stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching everything unfold. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't stop him. Eventually, Garrett was invited to their recital. It was a big moment, one Lauren hadn't offered lightly. He dressed in a simple navy sweater and jeans, trying not to look like a man who once lived in custom-tailored suits. The auditorium was packed, full of parents and teachers, music echoing off the walls. When the twins took the stage, Garrett's breath caught. They moved in perfect harmony, every step light and deliberate, their faces filled with quiet joy. He didn't know anything about ballet, but he knew what pride felt like. And it hit him with a force he wasn't ready for. After the performance, Emma ran straight to him. "Did you see? Did you see us?" she asked, cheeks flushed and eyes shining. Garrett bent down and pulled her into a hug without thinking. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. Evie approached more slowly but stood beside him, close enough for her shoulder to brush against his. He looked down at them both and smiled. "You were incredible," he said. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Lauren came over, holding their coats, and something in her expression had changed. Not completely. Not surrender. But something softer. "They talk about you," she said quietly as the girls ran ahead. More and more every day. Garrett nodded. He knew what that meant. They were letting him in. Not all at once, and not without fear. But they were opening the door. And this time, he was staying. As the weeks passed, Garrett's presence became part of the girls' routine. He was no longer just a figure in the background or a mysterious adult who watched from the sidelines. He was the man who waited for them after class, who asked about their day, who remembered which of them liked strawberries and which hated them, who carried their bags when they were tired and tied their shoelaces without being asked. There was still distance, especially with Evie, who remained more guarded, but even she had started to offer quiet smiles and small nods in his direction. Emma, in contrast, had fully embraced his presence. She told him about her dreams, her classmates, the way she wanted to go to Paris and dance on rooftops. She drew pictures for him, little crayon sketches of buildings with wings, stages in the clouds, and once, one that made him stop breathing for a moment, a family of 3 holding hands under a tree. She had labeled them in shaky handwriting, me, Evie, and Dad. When she gave it to him, she did it casually, without ceremony, but Garrett kept it folded in his wallet like it was the most valuable document he'd ever owned. He began to take on more responsibilities, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to. He picked them up from school when Lauren was working late. He learned how to braid hair by watching YouTube videos late into the night. He helped them rehearse lines for a school play, even acting out the smaller roles with exaggerated voices that made them fall over laughing. They started calling him Dad one at a time. First Emma, testing it in a whisper like trying out a new pair of shoes. Then Evie, quietly and without eye contact, like she was releasing something she'd been holding in for far too long. The first time he heard it, he didn't respond immediately, not out of shock, but because the word hit him with so much weight he didn't trust his voice not to crack. It wasn't just the girls who changed. Garrett changed too. He stopped checking his email every 5 minutes. His phone stayed in his pocket more often. He didn't wake up thinking about quarterly profits or stock prices. Instead, he thought about whether the girls had clean ballet tights, if he had enough groceries for their favorite snacks, whether he'd remembered to sign the school form for Friday's field trip. It was a different kind of stress, quieter but more meaningful. He found himself laughing more. Sleeping better. Feeling human in a way he hadn't in years. Lauren saw the change as well. Slowly, her walls came down. They shared coffee some mornings after school drop-off. She told him stories about Maggie, how she'd dance in the living room to old French songs, how she used to believe that music could fix everything. Garrett listened more than he spoke. He wanted to collect those fragments of Maggie, to piece together a picture of the woman he never really got to know. Sometimes, Lauren would leave the girls with him for short periods. An hour turned into an afternoon. Then a whole evening. It was never spoken aloud, but the trust was being rebuilt, breath by breath. Then, one night, Garrett got a call. It was Evie's voice, soft and trembling. She had woken from a nightmare and asked Lauren if she could call him. He didn't ask questions. He just told her to breathe, that he was here, that she was safe. She didn't say much, but she stayed on the line until her breathing evened out. After she hung up, Garrett sat in silence, holding the phone in his hand like it had suddenly become the most sacred object he owned. He wasn't trying to replace Maggie. He couldn't. But he was becoming something else, something real, something steady, something that could be counted on. Not a visitor. Not a temporary presence. A father. And though the journey had been slow, filled with small moments and tentative steps, Garrett understood now that this was what love really looked like. Not grand declarations or perfect timing. Just staying. Choosing to stay, even when it was hard. Especially then. It had been nearly a year since Garrett first walked into that charity recital by mistake, and everything in his life had changed since then. He had built his world out of steel, strategy, and solitude, but now it was filled with dance shoes in the hallway, glitter-covered school projects on the fridge, and two little girls who clung to him like he had always been there. He didn't miss his old life, not the boardrooms, not the endless deadlines, not the empty victories that used to thrill him. For the first time, his success wasn't measured in numbers but in moments, like the way Evie now reached for his hand without thinking, or how Emma had started calling him Dad without hesitation, like the word had always belonged to him. But happiness has a way of drawing shadows. It started with a letter, an official-looking envelope delivered to Lauren's mailbox. At first, Garrett thought it was a mistake, until Lauren called him with tension in her voice and said, "You need to come over now." When he arrived, she handed him the letter and watched as he read it in silence. It was from a woman named Judith Carter, Maggie's aunt. Someone Garrett had never heard of, and apparently, neither had Lauren in over a decade. The letter stated that Judith had learned about the twins and intended to seek custody, citing concerns about their current living situation and the sudden involvement of a wealthy stranger claiming to be their father. She was threatening legal action. Garrett's initial reaction was fury. Where had this woman been when Maggie died? Where was she during all the nights Lauren stayed up comforting two newborns on her own? Where was she when the girls needed new shoes or medicine or help with school? He had seen this kind of tactic before, in business, when people saw opportunity and tried to mask greed with righteousness. But this was different. This was personal. Lauren, for her part, was less angry and more afraid. She knew how the system worked. She had raised the girls without official adoption, acting as their legal guardian under emergency family placement. And now that Garrett was involved, with his high profile and sudden presence, the story looked messy. The courts didn't always care about love, about effort, about sleepless nights. Sometimes, they just looked at the paper. They tried to stay calm for the girls, but children always know when something is wrong. Evie started asking if she and Emma were going to have to move. Emma clung to Garrett when he said goodnight, whispering, "You won't let them take us, right?" Garrett held her tightly and told her the truth. Not a chance. Their lawyers warned them that Judith had hired a powerful family law attorney known for using personal scandals to sway cases. Almost immediately, Garrett's past became public property. Articles began to surface. Billionaire CEO claims secret children. Cold empire builder turned sudden father. Old photos, headlines, quotes from former colleagues who were all too eager to paint him as emotionally unavailable and image-obsessed flooded the internet. His reputation crumbled overnight. Investors pulled out of partnerships. Boards requested his resignation from projects he'd spent years building. The press didn't care about truth. They wanted the narrative. But Garrett didn't fight back in the way the world expected. He didn't launch PR campaigns or hire reputation consultants. He focused on one thing, protecting the girls. He doubled down on presence. He showed up at every school function, every doctor's appointment, every rehearsal. He answered their questions with honesty, not promises. He sat through court evaluations with quiet strength and let the facts speak for themselves. He told the truth, how he hadn't known they existed, how he regretted the years he'd missed, and how he was willing to lose everything else to make sure they stayed where they belonged. The court hearings were brutal. Judith painted Lauren as unstable and Garrett as opportunistic. But then the girls were called to speak, not in front of the whole courtroom, but in private sessions with child advocates. And it was their words that began to shift everything. Emma described how Garrett made her feel safe. Evie said he never forced her to talk, just listened until she was ready. They both said the word home when they talked about him. And it was home. Chaotic and imperfect, yes, but full of love. When the judge finally delivered the decision, there was a long pause that felt like it cracked time in half. Judith's petition was denied. Full guardianship would remain with Lauren, and Garrett was granted full legal recognition as their father, with shared custody. The judge emphasized that the best interest of the children had been met not through blood alone, but through presence, consistency, and commitment. Garrett didn't smile or celebrate when he heard the ruling. He just looked at Lauren, then at the girls sitting behind her, and exhaled for the first time in weeks. There was still a long road ahead. But they weren't going anywhere. And neither was he. The weeks after the custody ruling felt like breathing after nearly drowning. There was no explosion of joy, no grand celebration, just a quiet settling, a sense that, for the first time, the ground beneath them had stopped shifting. Garrett hadn't just fought to keep his daughters close, he had dismantled the very version of himself that once believed he didn't need anyone. Now, every part of his life was built around those two little girls and the woman who had raised them when no one else did. It wasn't simple. Healing never was. But the chaos had cleared, and in its place was something real. Garrett sold the penthouse. It felt like a monument to a man he no longer was. He bought a small house in the same neighborhood as the studio, a modest, sunlit home with a yard where the girls could play and a kitchen big enough for baking messes. He didn't care that it lacked sleek finishes or high-rise views. What mattered were the tiny ballet shoes by the door, the drawings taped to the fridge, and the laughter that bounced off the walls. He painted the girls' bedroom himself, chose matching beds, and helped them string fairy lights above their windows. Emma insisted on stars. Evie wanted bookshelves. He gave them both. Lauren still lived a few streets away, but she was there nearly every day. They hadn't defined what they were now, family, partners in parenting, something more, but it didn't matter. Their connection was unspoken but deeply felt. Sometimes they'd talk for hours over coffee, sometimes they'd simply exchange tired glances over homework and dinner prep, understanding everything without saying much at all. Garrett had learned to listen. He no longer filled silences with solutions. He sat with them, waited, and let things unfold. That was the greatest gift fatherhood had given him, patience he never knew he was capable of. His old life still hovered in headlines. There were articles questioning his sincerity, analyzing his downfall, speculating on whether his reinvention was strategic or sincere. He ignored them. People could say what they wanted. He no longer measured himself by their opinions. His empire was gone, but he didn't miss it. He had traded marble floors for sidewalk chalk and never looked back. He spent his mornings walking the girls to school, waving at the same neighbors he used to overlook. He helped with recitals, chaperoned field trips, sat through endless show-and-tell presentations. The community had begun to see him differently, not as the cold mogul from the news, but as the man who showed up, every day, rain or shine, no press, no speeches, just presence. The girls trusted him now in a way that ran deeper than words. They didn't ask if he was staying anymore. They knew. One night, after tucking them in, he stood in the hallway and looked at a framed photo on the wall, a picture of Maggie, smiling with the twins in her arms. It had been taken just weeks before her death. The photo was a little faded, the frame handmade by the girls in art class, covered in dried glitter and crooked stickers. Beneath it sat the bracelet. Garrett had placed it in a shadow box, right next to a note Maggie had once written and that Lauren had found tucked in a journal. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but he read them often. If anything happens to me, I hope they find someone who sees them, not for what they are, but for who they could become. Someone who stays. Garrett wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't want applause or redemption. He only wanted to be the man Maggie had believed might still exist inside him. And he wanted to be worthy of the trust his daughters had given him, trust built not on blood, but on showing up again and again, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it hurt, even when it would have been easier to disappear. The world outside still called him Garrett Winslow, former CEO, fallen tycoon, man who lost everything. But inside that little house with the squeaky door and mismatched mugs, he was simply Dad. And it was more than enough. Spring arrived quietly, like a whisper rather than a declaration. The air grew softer, the days longer, and the trees along Garrett Street began to bloom with tiny pink blossoms that fluttered down like confetti every time the wind passed through. It had been a full year since the night he walked into that charity recital by mistake, only it no longer felt like a mistake. It felt inevitable, like the world had been slowly guiding him toward that moment, toward the two little girls who had cracked open his life and made space for something better. Life had settled into a rhythm that once would have terrified him with its simplicity. Morning chaos was the new board meeting, packing lunches, finding missing shoes, brushing tangled hair while pouring coffee. He still made mistakes. Once he forgot Evie's dance bag and had to drive back through city traffic with a bag of leotards and snacks, arriving just as the music started, but he learned to laugh at himself, and the girls laughed with him. Even Lauren laughed more these days. She no longer looked like she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. They had become a team, even if neither of them had put a name to it. Some things didn't need names to be real. Garrett had created something unexpected in the year since his world unraveled, a small nonprofit named the Maggie Moore Foundation, dedicated to supporting community arts programs and single parents. He didn't make speeches or hold galas. Instead, he quietly funded ballet classes for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and offered grants to women who were trying to rebuild their lives. He never put his name on anything. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure no child slipped through the cracks because someone believed they weren't worth the effort. One afternoon, just before the twins' spring recital, Garrett stood backstage holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself from the park. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, not a suit, and there was a smudge of glitter on his wrist from helping Evie fix a last-minute costume issue. The auditorium was full. Parents, teachers, friends. He should have felt nervous. Instead, he felt steady. The girls were dancing to a piece called Home, choreographed by their teacher with them in mind. Garrett had watched them practice it dozens of times in the living room, the way they moved with quiet grace, like they knew the story their bodies were telling. When they stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. The music began, gentle, slow, and Garrett's breath caught. Emma and Evie moved like they were born for it, like the stage belonged to them, and as they danced, Garrett felt something in his chest shift. Not break, but open. After the final note, the audience erupted into applause. The girls took their bows, hand in hand, smiling in a way that could light up a city. Garrett stood clapping until his hands stung. When they found him after the performance, they didn't run. They walked up to him with all the confidence in the world, and Emma, grinning, asked, "Did we do okay?" Garrett knelt down, kissed the top of each of their heads, and said, "You were magic." That night, they had dinner at home, pizza and orange soda, the girls still in their costumes, glitter on the floor, laughter echoing through the house. After they fell asleep, curled into each other like they had since birth, Garrett sat in the hallway outside their room and watched them for a long time. There were no more questions in his mind. No more fear that he wasn't enough. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. He was theirs. And they were his. He passed by the photo of Maggie on the wall as he walked to the kitchen. She was smiling in that way she always had, mischievous and knowing, as if she had seen all of this coming. Next to her photo, the bracelet sat in its glass case, still shining under the soft hallway light. It was no longer a symbol of the past. It was a promise kept. Garrett poured a cup of tea, stepped out onto the porch, and let the quiet of the evening wrap around him. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He had already arrived. And in that stillness, with the sound of crickets in the distance and the memory of his daughter's laughter in the air, he finally understood what it meant to be whole. Not because he had built something great, but because he had stayed. Because he had chosen love when he could have walked away. And that, he knew, would always be the finest thing he'd ever done. To me, the ending of this story isn't about a perfect resolution, it's about the quiet power of transformation. Garrett didn't win back a fortune, or rebuild his empire, or return to the top of the business world. What he did was far more meaningful. He became a man who chose love over legacy, presence over power, and family over fear. Watching him go from emotionally distant and self-focused to someone who finds peace in bedtime routines and glitter-covered drawings feels like the kind of arc we don't see enough, subtle, honest, and deeply human. What I love most is that the story doesn't try to erase his flaws or pretend the journey was easy. He lost things, yes, but he found something real, a home, not made of walls and wealth, but of trust, forgiveness, and the willingness to stay. And that makes his quiet, porch-lit ending one of the most powerful kinds of happy there is, the kind you earn.